May Day, 1971. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam has the world's 5th largest army, but its people function as a guerrilla society. A generation is born and disciplined to war. Two great powers fight them, but cannot match their determination. "20 million people fight 30 years of war. The tonnage of high explosives dropped on the North Vietnamese exceeds that used by the U.S. throughout World War II. Vietnam's United Nations ambassador, Ha Van Lao.
Naturally, it was terrifying, but you know our people. We have the ability to adapt ourselves, to overcome difficulties. We had to, in order to adapt ourselves to a life of war. Because without that, we would have been beaten. We would have lost the war.
The battle is fiercest near the partition line. Entire communities live underground for years. Despite America's vast commitment to the war, many policymakers claim the U.S. lacked basic knowledge about its enemy and so developed the wrong strategy. After 20 years of involvement, the U.S. military had few recognized intelligence experts. General Edward Lansdale.
Well, looking back at the Vietnam War, it strikes me as very odd that we really didn't know any of the leaders on the other side. We, meaning not only the American people, but probably our presidents and our leadership in Washington.
From its guerrilla beginnings in 1945, Ho Chi Minh's nation is shaped by men dedicated to a communist Vietnam. Their faces, names, and background are largely unknown, yet the wartime leadership remains essentially unchanged. There is the political mastermind. Name, Le Duan, born 1908 in South Vietnam. Le Duan, like his colleagues, becomes a Marxist in the fight against the French. He develops the political organization. Le Duan spends years in South Vietnam organizing the guerrilla resistance called the National Liberation Front. He takes over as first secretary of the Communist Party. There's the longtime prime minister who directs day-to-day government and becomes Hanoi's public voice. Name, Pham Van Dong, born 1906 at Hue, Central Vietnam. Dong is highly educated, the son of a Mandarin. He helps found the Viet Minh, the peasant movement which fights the French. He negotiates peace in 1954. The agreement partitions Vietnam. He becomes prime minister, and as premier sees Vietnam united 21 years later. There's the military mastermind. Starting with 34 volunteers, he eventually commands a 1 million-man army. Name, Bo Nguyen Giap, born 1912 in central Vietnam. Giap is politically active from age 14. Though poor, he studies law, then teaches history. His wife dies in a French jail. He joins the Viet Minh. At age 27, he plans the guerrilla strategy which defeats the French. He has military command for 30 years. And there is the legendary president, at first unknown even to the Vietnamese. Name Nguyen That Tan. Born 1890 in central Vietnam. The world knows him as Ho Chi Minh, one of his many aliases. At age 21, he goes to France to seek political reforms for Vietnam. He spends years in Russia and China, returning to his homeland 30 years later. In 1945, he proclaims independence. 30 years of war follow. In the North, Ho creates a single-minded society with one goal, one Vietnam. An expert on North Vietnam, Brian Jenkins.
We're also talking about a society that is enormously disciplined, a society that historically was well disciplined, and during the course of the war, every aspect of that society was geared toward fighting the war. I mean, we are not talking about a society with a free press, we're not talking about a society with open debate, we're talking about a society where the production, the economy, every newspaper, virtually every poem, artistic activity was all geared toward that war effort.
The war in the North is most intense along infiltration routes near the border with the South. The U.S. bombards this region almost daily for 8 years. Hanoi diplomat Ha Van Lao.
When the enemy planes arrived, everyone participated in the anti-aircraft defense. Whether it was an active defense, such as manning the guns, or whether it was a passive defense, one of creating conditions in which the civil population wouldn't be harmed by the bombing. And after the planes left, everyone would pick up their work, whether it was in the factories, the fields, the city, or the country.
To guard the border area, the population of the Vinh Linh region goes underground. Year by year, they extend the tunnel community. According to Hanoi, the strange world of Vinh Linh finally winds for hundreds of miles, sheltering 70,000 people. Vinh Linh is upheld as an example of national sacrifice. People are encouraged to serve here. Between bombing raids, the peasants cultivate livestock and crops. Trenches crisscross the fields. The tunnels are organized like a city. There are nurseries, hospitals, recreation areas. Most of the population has never known peace. The entire society revolves around the war. Journalist Wilfred Burchett.
It was compulsory for the kids to wear green camouflage when they went to school. Roughly whatever the vegetation was in the area. But I remember once driving through, and to my great astonishment, a whole field of maize suddenly got to its feet and charged across the road. And these were the local peasant militia.
The priority is to keep open supply routes. Women militia are drafted to defend them.
Women played a very considerable role. In the early days, my first visits, I would say about half of the local village self-defense units, and probably more, were in fact women who actually, knew how to handle rifles and grenades and whatever it was. In the North, the women had very largely taken over from the men in agricultural production. You saw women everywhere working in the fields and doing jobs which previously women never handled at all, plowing and harrowing and that sort of thing.
Our army was by nature a popular army. It was composed of 3 categories: the local militia, the regional units, and the units of the regular army, An ordinary fighter in the regular army was normally 20 to 25 years old. The majority of them had secondary school education, and they had the possibility of continuing their studies in night classes, if conditions permitted it. Entertainment, relaxation, that was the business of the cultural section of the army, and we attached a great deal of importance to it for our fighters. There was a cultural team that offered dances, singing, music. They even organized basketball teams, volleyball teams. Teams of athletes would compete against one another. The army versus the civil defense.
General Giap's military hero is Napoleon. I've lost some battles, but never lost a war, says Giap. Effectively, his army is the entire population. Whether in or out of uniform, everyone is assigned war duties. The leadership sets an example of self-discipline. The Prime Minister lives in the servants' quarters of the former colonial governor. Party Chief Le Duan receives a salary of $10 a month, the same as all other government officials. Ho Chi Minh constantly tells them, stick together. They do.
In terms of their personal life, our leaders were very much united because they struggled under the same conditions. They'd been in the same prisons. They fought together, shoulder to shoulder. That's why the experience of the common struggle united them, not only in ideology, but in a life of revolutionary struggle.
Ho Chi Minh regards his role as a teacher who could achieve greatest results through personal contact, and what he taught was patience. During 8 years of bombing, towns in the border provinces are destroyed. Nam Dinh, North Vietnam's third largest city, it is a transportation and textile center, frequently bombed. The damage is widely publicized. Visitors taken to the city 50 miles south of Hanoi find churches, homes, schools destroyed. Most of the 90,000 population is evacuated, but they adjust, says Ha Van Lao.
That is why, in spite of the very savage, very barbaric bombings of the enemy planes, life had to continue.
9 out of 10 workers in key industries are relocated in mountain caves. Some move 3 or 4 times as a result of the bombing. A typical Hanoi machine tool factory is broken down into 50 separate workshops scattered outside the city. Work continues in 3 shifts to maintain the war on the south. Individual hardships continue for 30 years. Food is about subsistence level. In 1967, the monthly ration per person is 1 pound of meat and 8 pounds of rice. In a year, each person is allowed 5 yards of cloth, enough for 1 shirt and 1 pair of trousers, the standard dress for men and women. Some workers are relocated hundreds of miles from their homes. As a result, some children are separated from their parents for years. This has happened before in Vietnam. The evacuated areas were first used in 10th century wars. They live now where their ancestors fought. The students wear the red kerchief of the Communist Youth Movement. The lesson combines a 1,000-year history of Vietnamese nationalism with Marxism. Communist affairs expert Brian Jenkins.
Without being deterministic about saying that one is trapped by history to repeat history, there were, to be sure, powerful historical forces in Indochina that did have a major impact on the course of events there. As an historian, I would tend to go back several centuries and to say that I could come up with patterns that had recurred over 500 and 600 years. They successfully attached themselves to these powerful traditions. They made history work for them. And psychologically and politically, this put the South Vietnamese and the Americans as foreign intruders very, very much at a disadvantage. They were able to take advantage of this powerful tradition of resistance. In some cases, one is talking about the resistance to Chinese rule for centuries.
All civilians must contribute to the war. Clearing highways and rail lines becomes a specialist task. An estimated 500,000 civilians, mostly women, are mobilized as repair gangs, traveling wherever needed. By 1968, Hanoi claims that 80% of all towns and cities of the North have been bombed. Hanoi has not been bombed. During the 1960s, the U.S. fears that destroying Hanoi might bring the Soviet Union or China into the war. But thousands of concrete cylinders are placed every few yards on each street as air raid cover. Half a million people, 1/3 of its population, are kept in Hanoi in fixed industries and government jobs.
Everyday life had to continue. Above all, production had to continue and even intensify. Because if we hadn't increased production, how could we have kept ourselves supplied to continue the war? In the urban centers, to save the life of the civil population, we dug trenches everywhere.
The shovel becomes the tool of national survival. A 16-hour workday is normal for decades. The chief strategy is to outweight the enemy. The money North Vietnam spends on the war is unknown, but the war does demand tremendous economic sacrifice. In government stores, there are long queues for cigarettes called Diem Bien Phu. Luxury is a mosquito net. In the late 60s, food rations increase with Soviet aid. Even then, officials tell visitors, we are terribly hungry. But at all times, traditional Vietnamese culture is maintained.
And I can even say that we didn't lack for recreation either. There were performances. There were cultural evenings for the people. And when the night alarms sounded, we'd disperse. When the planes were gone, then the shows would begin again. And that was life during the bombings.
North Vietnam is regarded by American policymakers as a puppet state, first of China, then of the Soviet Union. But Hanoi tells the people they are fighting for independence. The North, in turn, cannot understand U.S. motivations. Hanoi does not recognize South Vietnam as a legitimate country. the war for one Vietnam is presented as a national crusade. U.S. policymakers underestimate the nationalist appeal of Hanoi's leaders, says historian Brian Jenkins.
I think when we talk about the North Vietnamese leadership, we are talking about dedicated Marxists, but dedicated Marxists who nonetheless are as traditional as the ancient Confucian mandarins that ran that country centuries ago. In fact, it's intriguing that some of the leadership traces its origin in terms of its own families, not the proletarian backgrounds, but rather to advisors to the emperors, to court mandarins in some cases. No, it clearly the Marxism, while legitimate and true to those leaders, was very, very, very much something which one put on top of a Vietnamese nationalism.
By 1980, the youngest member of the ruling committee is 69 years old. Patience is regarded as both the greatest virtue and weapon. Some Western observers say the leadership is stagnant and unable to adjust to peace.
If one looks at Vietnamese history, and the communists certainly did, they were able to bite off half centuries in a gulp, whereas we think of 5 years or 10 years as being a long time. Ho Chi Minh's boast that they were willing to fight 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or longer if necessary, was not an idle boast, but rather really reflected a Vietnamese perception of history. It made probably little difference to them whether ultimately they would achieve their ends in the year 1969, 1970, 1975. It could just as easily have been the year 2000.
North Vietnam's leaders are judged by some Western experts to be more nationalist than Marxist. The leaders call this a false view. But the people are told that U.S. military support of the Saigon government is just more foreign occupation. And later, Vietnam's one-time ally, Communist China, is regarded as another foreign invader. In Vietnam, the United States fought not only communism, but a long history of uncompromising nationalism. Vietnam, 1945-75. 3 decades, 2 wars, 1 objective.
I haven't seen anything to indicate that at any time during the entire Vietnam War, even the height of the bombing at any time, that there was any threat to the stability of that leadership, nor in fact even any major debate within that leadership as to goals.
What united them, and what still unites them, is our environment. The ardent patriotism, the true patriotism. The profound love of independence and liberty that goes hand in hand with love of socialism.
Prime Minister Pham Van Dong answers the question raised over 30 years.
Why are you like you are? Why are the Vietnamese like they are? What's in you? What makes you tick? And he laughed and said, well, you know, what is our history? There's nothing else in our history except struggle. Struggle against foreign invaders, always more powerful than ourselves. Struggle against nature. We've had nowhere else to go. We had to stay where we were and fight things out where we were. And the result of this after 2,000 odd years, he said, is that it's created a very stable nervous system in our people. We never panic. And whatever new situation arises, our people say, oh, well, there it goes again. He repeated this 3 times. There is nothing else in our history except struggle.